After 22 years of building a $145 million empire, my parents discarded me like trash at their own anniversary party. But what they do not know is that I am holding a secret in my hands that will burn their entire house of cards to the ground. They say your hands tell the story of your life before you even open your mouth. I looked down at mine, the skin mapped with a dozen silver scars from rogue splinters and a deep jagged line across the palm where a snapped cable nearly took my thumb in the Eugene sawmill 20 years ago. These were the hands of a man who understood the density of Douglas fir and the brutal honesty of a 16-hour shift. But tonight, in the grand ballroom of our estate in the Hamptons, these hands felt like an insult. They were wrapped around a flute of vintage Baccarat crystal, the amber champagne inside costing more than I used to make in a month of grading timber. I am Caleb Sterling. If you have framed a luxury home on the West Coast, or walked across a premium hardwood floor in a Manhattan penthouse, you have likely touched the soul of Sterling Timber and Land. For 22 years I have been the ghost in the machine. I was at the mills at 5 in the morning, while the mist still clung to the Oregon hills. I handled the union strikes in the freezing rain of February. I managed the supply chain through 3 recessions. I lived and breathed sawdust so that the Sterling name could remain synonymous with American strength. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of that loyalty. It was my father and Eleanor's 35th wedding anniversary, a glittering affair where the air smelled of salt spray and expensive perfume. Harrison Sterling stood at the center of the room, looking every bit the patriarch at 72. His hair was a mane of distinguished silver, his tuxedo tailored to perfection. Beside him, Eleanor, my mother, was a vision of cold elegance in a silk gown the color of moonlight. She had spent the evening playing the perfect hostess, her smile as precise and unyielding as a diamond. I felt Sarah, my wife, squeeze my hand. She knew how much I had sacrificed. She had been the one to wash the grease out of my work shirts and stay up late with me while I pored over quarterly reports. Our 9-year-old daughter Maya stood between us, her eyes wide as she took in the chandeliers and the sea of influential guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison's voice boomed, cutting through the polite chatter of the elite. 45 years ago, Eleanor and I began a journey. We did not just build a company, we built a legacy that spans generations. We have always believed that the future belongs to those with the vision to see beyond the horizon. I adjusted my tie, feeling a surge of quiet pride. I expected a nod, a mention of the record profits I had secured last year, or perhaps the formal announcement of my transition to Chief Executive Officer. I had earned that seat through sweat blood and a total devotion to the Sterling heritage. The world is changing. Harrison continued, his gaze sweeping past me as if I were part of the furniture. Modern industry requires a different kind of leadership. It requires the sophistication of global markets and the finesse of new age strategy. Therefore, tonight, Eleanor and I are proud to announce our succession plan. We are leaving our entire estate, the controlling interest in Sterling Timber and Land, and our full investment portfolio, a legacy valued at $145 million, to our son Julian. The room erupted in thunderous applause. I felt the air leave my lungs as if I'd been struck in the chest. Julian, my 37-year-old brother, stepped forward with a practiced, cinematic smile. He was the golden boy of the Ivy League, a man whose only experience with wood was choosing the finish on his mahogany desk at his boutique consulting firm in London. He had never stepped foot in a sawmill. He had never negotiated a harvest contract. Yet there he stood, the newly anointed king of the Sterling Empire. Julian represents the evolution of our family name. Eleanor added, her voice smooth and devoid of warmth as she looked at her favorite son. He has the education from Harvard and the connections in Washington to take us into the next century. I looked at Sarah. Her face had gone pale, her grip on my hand so tight her knuckles were white. She knew this was not just a professional snub, it was a total erasure of my life's work. "Daddy," Maya's small voice pierced through the ringing in my ears. She tugged on my sleeve, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Why did Grandpa say Julian's name? Why did he not say yours? Did you do something wrong?" I could not answer her. The lump in my throat was too large to swallow. My father was still at the microphone laughing with the senator, while Julian began shaking hands with the board members who had once called me for advice. I was being relegated to a footnote of valued employee who would now report to a brother who did not know the difference between a cedar and a pine. The humiliation was a physical weight. I realized then that my parents had never seen me as a successor. I was merely the engine that kept the wealth moving so that Julian could live the life of a prince. I looked at the silver-haired man I had called father for 35 years, and for the first time I saw the stranger behind the mask. Without a word, I set my glass down on a passing tray. The crystal clinked against the metal, a sharp, lonely sound. I ignored the confused glances from my cousins and the whispered comments from the neighbors. I turned my back on the golden light of the ballroom and walked toward the exit. I needed air. I needed to get away from the stench of betrayal that filled that house. I did not know where I was going, but I knew that the man who walked out of those French doors was no longer the loyal soldier they expected him to be. As I stepped into the cool night air of the parking lot, I had no idea that my entire reality was about to be dismantled by a woman waiting in the shadows. The gravel of the driveway crunched under my boots, a harsh contrast to the rhythmic string quartet playing inside. I reached my truck, a rugged vehicle that looked like a jagged rock in a sea of polished European luxury cars. My breathing was shallow, the adrenaline of the betrayal still coursing through my veins. I was about to reach for the door handle when a shadow detached itself from the side of a massive stone pillar. "You were always too much like Walter Caleb. You have his silence and his stubbornness," a voice said. It was a voice from my childhood, one I had not heard in over a decade. I turned to see a woman stepping into the amber glow of the security lights. She was dressed in a sharp, slate-gray trench coat, her hair a silver bob that looked as if it were carved from flint. It was Isabel Vance. She had been the chief financial officer for Sterling Timber and Land when my grandfather Walter was alive. She was the woman who knew where every cent was hidden and every secret was buried. My father had forced her into a very comfortable, very quiet retirement the moment Walter's heart stopped beating. "Isabel," I asked, my voice raspy, "what are you doing here? This is a private event. I am not here for the party, Caleb. I am here because I promised your grandfather I would wait for the day Harrison finally broke the last link of his integrity," she said, her eyes scanning the house with visible distaste. She held out a heavy, cream-colored expansion folder. "The truth is a heavy burden, but it is better than a comfortable lie." I took the folder. The weight of it felt significant, as if it contained lead rather than paper. "What is this?" "The missing chapters of your life," she replied. "Read it, now, before you go back inside and do something you cannot undo." I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck and flicked on the dome light. Isabel stood outside in the dark, a silent sentry. I opened the folder. The first document was a high-resolution photocopy of a death certificate from a hospital in Portland dated July 1990. The name on the certificate was Alice Margaret Sterling. The air felt thin. Alice, I had been told my mother, was Eleanor. I had been told Eleanor and Harrison were the golden couple of the industry. But this document stated that Alice was the wife of Harrison Sterling. She had died of complications from a pulmonary embolism 3 months after giving birth to a son. I flipped to the next page. It was a birth certificate. Caleb Walter Sterling, born to Harrison Sterling and Alice Margaret Sterling. I stared at the name of the woman I had called mother for 35 years. Eleanor was not my mother. She was the woman who had stepped into a dead woman's shoes before the grave was even cold. My father had married her barely a month after Alice passed away. "I do not understand," I whispered the words, fogging the windshield. "Why hide this? Why the lie?" "Eleanor came from a family with immense political capital but no liquid cash," Isabel said, leaning toward the window. "Harrison needed her connections to expand into federal lands. Eleanor needed his rising empire. But Eleanor had a condition. She would only marry a man with a clean slate. She did not want to be a stepmother. She wanted to be the matriarch. So Harrison erased Alice. He burned the photos, he paid the lawyers, and he moved across the country to start a new life with his first wife. My heart hammered against my ribs. But then I saw the second set of documents and the world truly stopped spinning. They were medical records from a private fertility clinic in Switzerland alongside a series of confidential bank transfers from Eleanor's personal account to an offshore agency. The records stated clearly that Eleanor Sterling was biologically incapable of conceiving. I looked at the adoption papers tucked in the back. They were for a boy born in a small town in Ohio to a 19-year-old girl who had been paid $60,000 to disappear. The boy was Julian. Julian is adopted, I asked my mind, struggling to process the scale of the deception. They gave everything to a boy who is not even a Sterling. Isabel's expression turned cold. That is the part you need to understand, Caleb. It is not they. It is her. Look at the correspondence between Eleanor and the agency. I read the letters. My blood turned to ice. Eleanor had orchestrated the entire adoption in secret, while Harrison was away on a 6-month timber survey in Southeast Asia. She had faked a pregnancy with the help of a corrupt doctor and presented Julian to Harrison as his biological son upon his return. "You mean?" I stammered, looking at Isabel in horror. "Yes," Isabel said firmly. "Harrison believes Julian is his flesh and blood. He thinks he is passing the empire to his own son to satisfy Eleanor's demands. He has no idea that he has spent 33 years raising a stranger while pushing his only real son into the dirt of the sawmills." The twist was sickening. My father was a man of many sins, but he was also a man obsessed with bloodline and legacy. Eleanor had played him like a fool. She had stolen his legacy and replaced it with a puppet she could control. "Harrison is many things," Isabel whispered, "but he is a Sterling. If he knew what she had done, he would burn this entire estate to the ground. You hold the match, Caleb. The question is, are you ready to light it?" I looked back at the house, the golden light shimmering through the trees. My father was inside, toasted by the elite, oblivious to the fact that the woman standing next to him had murdered his history and stolen his future. I closed the folder. The pain of the betrayal was still there, but it was being replaced by a cold, sharpened sense of purpose. I was not just a discarded son anymore. I was the only truth left in a family of ghosts. I did not return to the ballroom. I did not scream or demand an explanation. Instead, I drove through the night, the heavy cream folder resting on the passenger seat like a live explosive. While the rest of the Sterling family slept in their beds of silken lies, I headed towards Seattle. My grandfather, Walter Sterling, had always told me that a storm is best handled from the roots up. Monday morning found me in a glass-walled office overlooking Elliott Bay. Samuel Grant, a man whose family had managed the Sterling Trust for 3 generations, sat across from me. He looked at the documents Isabel Vance had provided, his face etched with a grim recognition. "Your grandfather was a cautious man, Caleb," Samuel said, rising to unlock a floor-to-ceiling vault. He emerged with a weathered, leather-bound journal. Walter did not trust Eleanor from the moment Harrison brought her home. He saw the way she looked at the company, not as a craft to be mastered, but as a throne to be seized. He suspected Harrison was being manipulated, though even he did not realize the depth of the deception regarding Julian. I opened the journal. My grandfather's handwriting was frantic but precise. One entry, dated 2 years before his death, chilled me to the bone. "Eleanor is a master of shadows. She has isolated Harrison from his past and reshaped his memory. I cannot stop the marriage, but I will ensure the blood of this company remains pure. If the fruit is poisoned, the roots must survive through Caleb." Samuel pointed to a legal addendum clipped to the back of the journal. "This is the lineal descendant clause, Walter, inserted into the primary trust. It states that only a biological heir of Walter Sterling can exercise voting control or inherit the core assets of Sterling timber and land. If a non-biological heir is ever named as successor, the entire estate automatically reverts to the closest living blood relative. In this case, that is you." "But I need proof," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. Paperwork from 30 years ago is a start, but I need modern, undeniable science. The next week was a calculated exercise in espionage. I returned to the estate under the guise of packing my remaining belongings from the guest cottage. I moved like a ghost through the halls of my youth. I found my first piece of evidence in the pool house. Julian had just finished a vigorous game of tennis with one of the board members. He had wiped a small cut on his forearm with a white polo shirt and tossed it into the laundry bin. I retrieved it, the small copper-colored stain of his blood being the key to his undoing. The second piece was more difficult. I entered my father's private study while he was at the club. On his mahogany vanity sat an old, silver-backed hairbrush, an heirloom from his own father. I carefully extracted several strands of his silver hair, sealing them in a sterile, glassine envelope. As I stood in that silent room, surrounded by trophies and photographs of a life built on a foundation of sand, the weight of the tragedy hit me. I looked at a photo of my father and Julian at the Harvard commencement. My father looked so proud, his arm draped around the young man he believed was his continuation. The pain was a dull throb in my ribs. I was the son of Alice, a woman whose very existence had been scrubbed from the earth to satisfy Eleanor's vanity. I was the result of a genuine love that had been betrayed by my father's weakness and Eleanor's ambition. Julian, on the other hand, was not a brother to be hated, but a tool in a long-range heist. He was a biological stranger dressed in a sterling suit groomed to be the face of a lie. I spent 3 days in a state of suspended animation while the lab in Seattle processed the samples. I spent that time in the woods walking among the ancient cedars on the edge of our property. These trees did not care about wills or trusts. They followed the laws of biology and time. When the call finally came from Samuel Grant, I was sitting on a fallen log, my hands stained with the dark earth of the forest. The results are conclusive, Caleb. Samuel's voice was heavy with the gravity of the news. The DNA from the polo shirt shares 0 markers with Harrison Sterling. There is no biological connection whatsoever. However, your profile is a perfect paternal match. You are the only Sterling left. I looked up at the canopy of trees, the light filtering through the needles in long golden shafts. The investigation in the shadows was over. I had the science, I had the law, and I had the journal of a dead man who had seen the truth coming from decades away. Eleanor thought she had won the day she convinced Harrison to announce Julian's succession. She thought she had buried Alice and silenced the past forever. But she had forgotten that a forest grows back after a fire often stronger than before. I was the fire, and I was coming for the throne she had stolen. I was no longer the discarded son. I was the rightful heir, and I held the power to dismantle her world with a single phone call. The boardroom of Sterling Timber and Land sat on the 40th floor of our downtown headquarters, a space of cold steel and glass that looked out over the sprawling forests that had built our name. I had called an emergency session utilizing a dormant clause in my contract that my father had forgotten existed. When I walked in, the tension was thick enough to choke the light. Harrison sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with indignation. Eleanor sat to his right, her hands folded over a designer handbag, her expression one of bored contempt. Julian was there too, looking uncomfortable in a charcoal suit, already trying to mimic the posture of a man in charge. "Caleb, this is an embarrassment," Harrison barked, his voice cracking slightly, a weakness I had never noticed before. "You were told the decision was final. To drag the board into a family dispute is beneath the dignity of this company. This is not a family dispute, Harrison," I said, my voice low and steady. "This is a reckoning." I stepped forward and threw the cream-colored expansion folder onto the center of the mahogany table. It slid across the polished surface, stopping inches from Eleanor's manicured fingers. "Open it," I commanded. Julian reached for it, but Harrison slapped his hand away, grabbing the documents himself. As he began to read, the color drained from his face. He saw the death certificate of Alice. He saw the marriage records. He saw the truth of the woman he had buried in the name of convenience. "What is this nonsense?" Eleanor hissed, though her eyes betrayed a flickering panic. Caleb has clearly fabricated these to spite us for the inheritance. The inheritance is exactly what we are here to discuss, I replied. I nodded to the door, and Samuel Grant entered, followed by Isabel Vance. The board members, men who had known my grandfather, leaned in with sudden, sharp interest. Harrison, Isabel said, her voice echoing with authority. You have spent 33 years believing a lie that Eleanor crafted the moment you left for your survey in Asia. You believed Julian was your son. He is not, Harrison roared, standing up so abruptly his chair tumbled backward. How dare you? Julian is my blood. I was there when he was born. You were there when a child was presented to you, Isabel countered, sliding the DNA results across the table. Julian was purchased for $60,000 from a girl in Ohio. Eleanor faked her pregnancy to secure her place as the mother of the Sterling heir. She knew that without a child, your father's trust would eventually favor Caleb. The room went silent. Julian looked at Eleanor, his mouth hanging open. Mother, what is she talking about? Eleanor did not look at him. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. You are a fool, Caleb. You think Harrison will believe a bitter old woman and a disgruntled son over me. Harrison grabbed the DNA report, his hands shaking violently. He compared the markers. He looked at Julian, then at me, then back at the paper. The realization was visible. It was the sound of a man's entire world fracturing. Is this true? Harrison whispered, looking at Eleanor. She did not answer. She stood up, reaching for her bag. We are leaving Harrison. This is a circus. Wait, Isabel Vance said, her voice dropping to a chilling register. There is one more thing the board needs to see. One more reason why the succession was moved up so suddenly. She produced a medical toxicology report and a series of high-resolution photographs of Eleanor's private vanity. For the past 2 years, Harrison's health has been declining. Memory lapses, tremors, heart palpitations. He thought it was age. It was not. Isabel looked directly at Eleanor. We found trace amounts of digitalis in the herbal supplements Eleanor has been preparing for him every morning. Not enough to kill him instantly, but enough to make him weak, enough to make him dependent. Enough to make him hand over the company to a boy Eleanor could control before Harrison had the chance to change his mind. Harrison slumped back against the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the woman he had married, the woman for whom he had erased his first wife and discarded his first son. He saw the predator behind the silver gown. You were killing me, Harrison asked, the betrayal finally breaking his voice. Samuel Grant stepped forward, clearing his throat. According to the lineal descendant clause, established by Walter Sterling, all transfers of power to Julian are null and void. Julian is not a biological heir. Therefore, effective immediately, the controlling interest of Sterling timber and land reverts to the only living blood descendant of Walter Sterling. Samuel looked at me. Caleb, the company is yours. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian stood frozen, a prince who had just realized his kingdom was made of smoke. Eleanor finally broke her facade, shattering into a scream of incoherent rage as security guards summoned by Samuel entered the room to escort her out. I watched them lead her away. I watched Julian follow her, looking like a lost child. But my eyes eventually landed on my father. He looked small. He looked like a man who had realized too late that he had traded his soul for a counterfeit. He reached out a hand toward me, his lips trembling, but I did not take it. The judgment was complete. The house of lies had collapsed, and as the board members began to stand and whisper, I realized that I was no longer the ghost in the machine. I was the master of the house, and the only thing left to do was to clean the blood and sawdust from the floor and begin again. The aftermath of the confrontation was a whirlwind of legal filings and flashing blue lights. Eleanor Sterling was escorted from the building in handcuffs, facing a litany of criminal charges, including grand larceny, inheritance fraud, and aggravated assault with a deadly substance. The woman who had commanded the social circles of the Hamptons with a silver tongue was now a headline in a cautionary tale about greed. Julian stood in the wreckage of his former life, stripped of his title and his future. On a rainy Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the board meeting, I met him in a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. He looked haggard, the Harvard Polish finally worn away to reveal a man who truly had nowhere to go. "I did not know Caleb," he said, staring into his coffee. "I swear to you, I thought I was who she said I was. Sam." I looked at him and saw a different kind of victim. He had been a puppet in a game he never asked to play. "I believe you, Julian. That is why I am not leaving you with nothing. I have set up a modest trust fund in Florida, far away from the Sterling name. It is enough for you to start a small business, to get an education that actually belongs to you, and to build a life where you are not someone's tool. But you can never come back to the company." He looked up, tears brimming in his eyes. "Why are you doing this after everything?" "Because, unlike Eleanor, I do not believe in using people," I replied. "Go be Julian. Just Julian. That is more than she ever allowed you to be." My first act as the head of the company was to dismantle the old branding. I signed a board resolution, CEO directive, to rename the corporation to Sterling Heritage Timber. The new logo featured 2 interlocking trees, a tribute to the mother who was erased, and the grandfather who refused to let the truth die. I did not govern from a high-rise office in Seattle. I moved the operational headquarters back to the Oregon Mills. I traded my Italian suits for flannel and work boots. I spent my days on the forest floor talking to the loggers and the engineers, making decisions based on the health of the land and the dignity of the workers. I led with the understanding of a man who had spent 22 years with sawdust in his lungs. Profits soared, not because we cut corners, but because for the first time in 45 years the company had a soul. Harrison retired to a small cottage on the coast. He was a broken man, haunted by the memories of Alice and the decades he had wasted under Eleanor's spell. I visited him once a month. We did not speak of the company or the money. We spoke of the weather and the tide. It was not a perfect forgiveness, but it was a quiet peace. 6 months later, I stood on a high ridge overlooking a vast pine grove on our family estate. The air was crisp, smelling of resin and the promise of a late autumn rain. Below me, Sarah was sitting on a wooden bench I had carved myself, watching Maya run through the tall grass. Maya's laughter echoed through the valley, a bright, pure sound that seemed to heal the very air. I looked at my hands. They were still scarred, still calloused, but they no longer felt like an insult. They were the hands that had reclaimed a legacy and built a sanctuary for the people I loved. I realized then that the $145 million was just a number on a ledger. The real inheritance was the silence in my mind, the absence of the heavy, suffocating weight of my parents' lies. I was finally free to be the man Alice had died to bring into this world. I watched Maya pick a wildflower and run toward her mother, her face glowing with a security I had never known at her age. She would grow up knowing exactly who she was. She would know that her father was a man of his word, and that her family was built on the solid ground of the truth. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long golden shadows across the timberland, I felt a profound sense of clarity. We often spend our lives waiting for others to validate our worth or hand us our destiny. We wait for a title, a name, or a seat at a table that was never meant for us, but the truth is much simpler and much more powerful. Your value does not lie in the name others give you, but in the strength you use to stand up after they try to break you. It is found in the courage to walk away from a lie and the integrity to build something real from the ruins. I was Caleb Sterling, the son of Alice, the heir to the forest, and for the first time in my life that was more than enough.